What is a supernatural event that happened in your life that just cannot be explained? One night I had a dream about my grandpa, who had died almost 20 years prior. We were in his home, and he kept telling me we need to clean the house, we need to get the house ready. When I asked him why, he just said she's coming home. My grandma, his wife of 50 years, died the next day. A family friend of ours, Gary, was terminally ill with cancer. He was a father figure to me and one of the few adult males from my previous life, I am a recovering alcoholic, that fully understood me. A friend and myself were in Moab, Utah and found a hostel to sleep in for the night. I had a dream about Gary. He looked amazing, completely healthy and backlit and was wearing a multicolored sweater. He looked at me with concern in his eyes, pointed backwards and said, "I'm not doing too good." I woke up a bit shaken because it felt so real. I told my girlfriend about the dream and she asked if I needed to call my mom to see how he was doing. I told her that it wasn't necessary because I knew they would call me if Gary passed. That day we drove from Utah to Colorado and stayed in another hotel. About 5 a.m. I woke up and my phone was ringing. I could see that it was my mom and I already knew what she was going to tell me. She broke the news that Gary had passed and I basically explained to her that Gary came and told me goodbye. I'm tearing up IRL right now writing this. The picture that his wife picked for his obituary was Gary in that multicolored sweater he was wearing when he came to me in my dream. Had a premonition I'd be involved in a car accident one morning on the way to work as I got out of bed. It was a very strange thought and I considered taking an alternate route but did not. As I got onto the highway it was raining and a car flew past me, hydroplaned, and slammed into my car. Working as night security for a small office at a sanitation plant. Building was a single entrance and you had to check in at the security station to get in or out. A worker shows up and checks in saying he needs to take care of a few things and grab some stuff. So I check in his ID and flip a few lights for him then go back about my business. Fast forward a few hours and my shift is about to end. I still haven't seen the guy come back. So I go patrol the building to find him and literally can't find him anywhere. He's not in any of the areas I turned lights on for him, no other lights are on. And he's not in any other rooms. I stop by security to see if we just missed each other and he's trying to leave, but nobody is there. I do a second patrol and still no signs. At this point I went to check cameras to see where he went, but he's not on a single camera except the one covering the entrance and security station. He turns down a hallway and never shows up on the next camera down said hall. At this point I logged it as an incident, and GTFO right as the relief shift showed up. Next day my boss calls me and says that worker had been on vacation out of state for several days, and wouldn't return for several more. Nobody could offer any explanation to what happened. The only way I can explain this one is wishful thinking. My mom and dad were codependent, and they liked it that way. They didn't want other people, other than the kids. They were completely happy to be just wrapped up in each other. My dad died the day before his birthday in a hospice center. Afterwards, it was like he was still home. His touch lamp beside his recliner would go on by itself. The recliner would rock like someone was getting in it, and sometimes, my mom or my sister would hear my dad saying, "Honey, fix me a cold drink?" That was exactly how he'd ask my mom to fill up his massive mug with Sprite over ice. My mother died less than a year and a half later. After my mother died, there was never another sign of either of them being there. They've been gone now for close to 14 years now. When I was a kid, about 10-12-ish, I was carrying a load of laundry upstairs home alone while mom was out doing errands. We have this weird carpet runner over our hardwood stairs that's only really attached at the top of the flight but otherwise not fitted or secured to each individual stair. So naturally I step on an air bubble of carpet with my vision obscured by the laundry and fall backwards while bear hugging a bunch of blankets. I specifically remember thinking "Velp, guess I'm about to die" while almost airborne with just my big toe left on the carpet when I felt two hands, one on either side of my shoulder blades, give me a firm shove that launched me back up on the step and diagonally against the stair rail. I assumed mom somehow silently came back early without announcing herself and turned around to thank her while still clinging to the railing, but no one was there. I scurried upstairs to put my things down while calling her name and walked the house afterwards to check if any doors were unlocked or if her car was there. I finally resorted to calling her cell where she told me she was hitting up a few more stores. It still feels like there's a presence on that stairwell, like someone's watching but in a protective way rather than sinisterly. Thanks for all the awards. I'll have to holler to the stairway ghost and let it know the internet loves it. Woke up one in the middle of the night to a man standing next to the bed staring at my so. He was slightly translucent and I figured it was just another sleep paralysis episode, had them before so knew the drill, and rolled over and went to go back to sleep. Normally being able to move isn't part of sleep paralysis, and immediately my heart began to race as I realized I need to roll over and check what I saw. Person was still standing there, staring at my so, then he made eye contact with me. Stared at me for a while before turning around and walking to the wall, slowly fading away with each step. Next morning so wakes up looking like SHD and said she had the worst night's sleep because she kept having the feeling that someone was watching her. Glad we no longer live in that house. When I was 9 or 10, it was a bad year. I was regularly physically and emotionally abused. But that year, I was sexually abused. On top of all that, I started having serious mental health issues. Well, when things were at their absolute worst, I started having dreams of this blonde lady telling me to hold on. That things would get better. It was so comforting and peaceful and continued as long as the extreme abuse continued. I didn't know who she was, I just figured I imagined her. Well, things finally simmer down, and the dreams stop. About a year later, Mom was going through old photo albums, and my blood freezes. I see the blonde woman from my dreams. I ask who she is. Turns out, it was an aunt I had who died shortly before I was born. I was about 15 and trying to sleep but having an asthma attack. Late in the night I started hearing a rhythmic breathing from the floor next to the bed. It wasn't scary, more comforting. And it wasn't me, because my breathing sounded way more messed up than that. It helped me calm down and get to sleep. Even though I was still sick, I was able to get my hands on an inhaler in the morning. At the time I thought it was a friendly ghost. I later rationalized that maybe I was hearing a family member through the heating ducts. What I realized years later, when I had a dog, was that it had sounded exactly like a big dog sleeping next to the bed. So now I'm 50-50 on whether a ghost dog came to visit me, or my own dog time traveled back about 10 years before she was born to comfort me. I had a dream once about my high school best friend who had moved out of state and started a family. I hadn't seen her or spoken to her in at least 10 years and had never met her child, except seeing pictures/posts on Facebook and commenting on them. In my dream I was walking down a street at night and out of nowhere her little girl appears next to me and I asked her, "Where is your mama? Why are you by yourself?" I remember her taking me to some bushes near a random house on the street and finding my friend in bad shape, beaten up or something, on the ground, and I remember running to the door of the random house screaming for help and to call the police. This is all I can recall from the dream, but I think there may have been a little more. The next day, I wake up and think to myself, man, that was weird. Maybe I dreamt of her because we had just spoken a little in comments of a Facebook post. I should send her a message. I go on about my day, go to work, get home later that day and sit on my couch and scroll through Facebook. Bam! 1,000 posts, rest in peace, etc., all of them tagged my friend and her daughter. I thought, what in the actual FCK? At that point there was no information as to what had happened, so I thought it must have been a car accident or something. Over the course of the next few weeks to months, more and more information came out and it was not an accident. My friend and her sweet baby had been murdered by some animal. I won't refer to them as a person. This happened about 5 years ago. I still remember the main parts of the dream vividly. I still am a little horrified that I had this dream that night. When it was happening possibly. I haven't been able to tell anyone else about it either because just thinking about it gives me chills. Super minor compared to many in this thread. Night before Thanksgiving 3 years ago I was across the country at my parents', driving back to theirs with my now wife from her friend's house. As we draw near, there is some type of bundle in the middle of the road. I stopped and pulled off to move it, and it turned out to be a barred owl that got clipped by a car. Long story short, I spent the rest of that night getting the owl into a puppy cage, gave it some food and water, and the next day dropped it off at a wildlife rescue center. I got home the next week, all the way across the country, New Jersey to Oregon. I stepped outside and there was a barred owl sitting on my fence watching me. It was gone by the time I got back. But now I know I'm straight with all owls. Not scary but still not explainable. When I was 22, I visited my grandma in her retirement home at Christmas. She was well, nothing out of the ordinary. A few days later I traveled to my then boyfriend across the country. 2 days after New Year's I woke up at 2 a.m. crying. And I just couldn't stop. I wasn't really sad or overly emotional, but the tears just kept streaming down my face. Nothing like that ever happened and I was kind of confused, as was my BF. I fell back asleep a few hours later. 3 days later I was informed that my grandma had died that night at about 2 a.m. Due to the divorce of my parents, communication was difficult and we were only informed after the funeral. I don't believe in anything supernatural, but it's hard to wrap my head around, especially since nothing like this ever happened again. I had a sort of demonic mask on my shelf, and one day while I was working at my desk no more than 4 feet away from it, it just flew off the shelf and shattered on the floor. It didn't just fall off the shelf, it was like someone threw it across the room. The baffling part to me is that I am the one who made the mask. So I know it's not cursed by some voodoo hex or something. I've had extremely vivid dreams of relatively inconsequential moments in my future life that I nonetheless keep locked away in a little corner of my head, and then when those moments actually occur, I get insane déjà vu that throws me off until I remember the dreams. It's a very bizarre thing, but it ultimately doesn't mean much to me, and edit since this seems to have blown up. Thank you everyone for sharing your similar experiences with us. And also thank you to those of you attempting to explain what could be going on when the events occur, no matter your stance on it. It's fascinating reading some of the details on what might cause it, or whether it's just some trick of the mind. It's very informative. Many years ago, my parents had separated and my father was planning on taking a trip across the country to California. He was pretty excited about it. I talked to him the day before he's leaving. Wish him well and tell him I'll talk to him after he gets to California. The day of his trip, he calls me and tells me he decided last minute not to go. Refuses to really get into why. Just says he changed his mind. Seemed really odd for something that he had been planning for a couple months. That night I'm sitting at my girlfriend's house and we're watching the news, and they report that US Air Flight 1493, the flight my dad was supposed to be on, collided with another aircraft while landing in Los Angeles. About 25% of the people on the flight were killed. Hard to know how my dad would have made out, because it really depended on where you were sitting, front versus back of the plane. It was several months before he finally told me that night before he was supposed to leave, he had an extremely vivid dream that he died in a fiery plane crash. So vivid that it scared him out of flying that day. My dad is a Marine Corps Vietnam veteran who saw combat. I can only imagine how vivid the dream must have been, to scare him out of getting on that plane that morning. Was in college walking to class. Went to cross a busy street and a hand grabbed my shoulder, quite hard, and stopped me. A car zoomed by that would have killed me. Nobody was behind me or anywhere close enough to have stopped me. Guardian angel? Early into my now wife and I's relationship I had a dream about her in childbirth. Very vivid, and long. Like I spent days in the hospital with her and everything was in a strange twilight. When it came time to deliver things went very wrong and she and baby ended up passing away. I woke up quite shook naturally but brushed it off. I am a nurse and have had to deal with traumatic OB situations before, and I chalked it up to me dealing with that stress through a dream. 6 years later and my wife is pregnant. I have forgotten the dream by now. I get a call late into the 3rd trimester while I am on shift. Wife is going to the ER for a bad BP. I get off my shift and go to meet her. As soon as I step into the room I remember my dream. It's the same damn room. Which is extra spooky because the hospital we were at wasn't even built when I had the dream. This is last year right when lockdown started. My wife has admitted they wanted to wait a week to deliver if possible. She will be kept in a twilight state until that time. So it's me in this room eerily isolated as the world around us is frozen and my wife is incoherent mere feet away. Lingering for days in this room I brushed off my dream, trying to manage my anxiety and stress. Come showtime my wife gets ready to begin pushing and it's exactly the same scenario as my dream. Things start going poorly, but the doctor thinks delivery is still possible, but at this point I finally freak out into full panic, and demand a C-section for my wife. The doctor I can tell wants to argue but I think my outburst made her step back and reassess the situation and she made the call for emergency C-section. Took 10 minutes for me to get taken back and as I'm in the OR I see my baby come out lifeless. They do everything they can and manage to resuscitate her. In the meantime my wife is doing poorly and they are scrambling to control her bleeding. I follow the baby out knowing there's really nothing I can do. Baby gets life flighted to another hospital, but before we go I see my wife stable and headed to the ICU. Both my wife and baby are critical but alive. Today they are both thriving and my baby is 16 months and just a tornado of energy. I don't know that they would be alive if not for that dream and it causing me to freak out and demand a change in plan. There's a story from when I was 4 to 5 years old. My grandmother was looking through old family photos and asking me who the people were. We got to a picture of my grandfather, and she asked me who he was, and I said, Poppy Jim. He died suddenly at home when my mother was 10, in the same house we lived in, so I never met him. She asked me how I knew that. I told her, oh, he comes and tucks me in and tells me he loves me sometimes after you go to bed. When I was going to my family's home I got in a SUV going down the road. This was in Bangladesh at the time and after taking the SUV the next 2 hours would be a highway going down a forest. I was sitting shotgun and along the highway there was an old man walking down the highway. He was hitchhiking and the driver decided to pick him up. He insisted on sitting in my seat and obliged as he was an older man. About an hour down the drive our car collided with a bus and the shotgun seat was mangled up. We all got out and we looked around but we couldn't find the old man that insisted on taking my seat anywhere. Stories like these aren't rare but I didn't believe them. We all know the man sat in my seat and we all saw him. But he was nowhere to be found. Edit, he just vanished. No blood. He was wearing ethnic attire which isn't peculiar around that area. He didn't speak at all, and we didn't ask him anything either. He just said to drop him off at the market ahead which would be in the town my house was in. One thing that was weird was that he spoke in an oldish Bengali. Like a old Bengali that we'd see in poetry from the 1800s. I didn't see it as peculiar cause he seemed like an ascetic. Second edit, I have pics of the collision if you guys were wondering. Third edit, when I said he didn't speak at all I meant during the ride. He didn't say anything other than where he wanted to go and insisting on my seat. My siblings and I all had the same dream on the same night a year ago. It was exactly 1 year after my mum died and we all had a dream about her and she was in the same place and was speaking to us. She reassured us that she was okay and she was with her mum and my dead siblings and that her dad is in the bad place. The next day we all realized we had the same dream. We even all independently drew a picture of the place we saw her and wrote down the name of the place it resembled. Most of my siblings took that as an actual message from my mum but my youngest sister and I like to believe that we have all developed some freaky hive mind low-level telepathy lol. When I was a kid, around 6, I lived in a very arid area, and a wide field of red dirt was between my house and my buds. Every day, walking over there, when I got about halfway across, I'd pick up a dirt clod or a small rock, and toss it behind me over my shoulder. About 10 seconds later, it would come flying back over my head and land in front of me. I just grin and keep walking. I remember this really distinctly, even trying to replicate it later in childhood after I had moved away, and being sad that it didn't work anymore. Didn't question it as a kid, but looking back, just really weird. Also my job site is haunted but this seems stranger. When I was 12 I woke up with a start at 2:30 in the morning. I wasn't dreaming and didn't know why I woke up. My parents told me the next morning that my grandfather had had a heart attack and went for emergency surgery. He died at 2:30 in the morning. I have an idea of what may have happened, but I cannot definitively say how this happened. My father died in 2000 in my parents' house. I was over one night pretty late after my mother had gone to sleep. I swear I could feel my father's presence, as I was right in the spot where he had died. They believe he had a heart attack while laying on the couch. Tried to get off the couch to call for help but fell on the floor and died, though no one else was home when it happened. I was on the couch when this happened. Anyway, I thought to myself, this is stupid. People don't leave essences behind, I'm not feeling anything. So, I say out loud, if this is really you, Dad, knock a box of cereal off the shelf onto the floor. I wanted to pick something I didn't think could happen by accident. I went into the kitchen and watched the shelf with the cereal on it for a few minutes and nothing happened. Since it was almost midnight, I decided to sleep in my old bedroom. I woke up the next morning and went downstairs and a box of cereal was laying on the floor. I say to my mother, "Did you knock that cereal onto the floor?" She said no, it was like that when she woke up, so. WTF, man. However, my mother had a cat. I'm guessing the cat did it. but I don't know for sure. If she'd gotten on the shelf, everything would have been knocked around and messy from her. Everything else was in its normal position, just the box of cereal was on the floor. I mean, regardless, it has to have been the cat, right? Edit. My mother also told me, months before this happened, that she felt my father get in bed with her one night after he died. She said, "Go away, Greg. You're dead. You don't need to go to bed anymore." And she says she felt him get out of the bed after that. Weird. My mother despised my father by the end of his life, though they remained married. It's not surprising she told him to GTFO. I have many, but here's the first that popped in my head. I was driving home from work after picking up my baby late at night. Not many cars around out on the country roads. The one stoplight out there was red for me, so I stop. It turns green and have a sudden voice or thought or whatever in my head saying don't go yet, nothing is coming. I'm still sitting at the green light. Right as I let off the brake, a semi comes flying through his red light. I was shook. My granddad died when I was 7, but, per his own words, I was his absolute favorite, partially because I am the splitting image of his mother, even into adulthood. When I was 21, I was set to give birth to my first son. I was about to get into the elevator to L&D when a man came in saying that he'd volunteer and he'd help me and my husband find our way. The elevator was slow, but we spent the time talking about what a blessing children are and how they grow up so fast. Here's the thing, he looked and sounded exactly like my granddad, same stature, same blue-gray eyes, same faint Scottish-Canadian accent, same khakis, check shirt, and sky blue cardigan. Even spookier is that the nurses said they don't have any older male volunteers in that particular building. I don't really believe in ghosts, but I'm absolutely certain Granddad paid me a visit that night. Well, when I was around 6 years old, I was walking down the stairs, no one was behind me, and all of a sudden I remember getting chills, then feeling a faint hand on my shoulder before I got basically pushed down the stairs. I was alright, a few cuts and bruises, nothing serious, but I still remember the feeling of the invisible hand on my shoulder. It haunts me. The night my friend took his own life, I had a sudden urge to call him. I'm in Canada and he was in Atlanta at the time. I didn't call because I was out partying with friends and got the news the next day when I woke up. I feel like I missed the chance to save a friend, but my dad says it was him letting me know he was gone but was going to be okay. I'm sorry I didn't reach out, bud. I regret it all the time. Already posted this a year and a half ago, but I'll go again. I have to make a bit of a premise. When I was little, the woman that came to clean my house, I'll call her Mary, while my parents were working, was also my babysitter. Usually after she ended up cleaning, she would bring me to her house until my mom would come and pick me up. There during the year I knew her whole family. Among these was her husband that I'll call Dave. So Dave was a pretty cool guy, just the average elder you would find in any rural town. He liked to drink wine with his friends at the bar, go hunting, and he had a lot of good and interesting stories to tell me when I was a kid, and after all these years spent together, he basically considered me as a grandson. Now, back when COVID hit for the first time in my country, I had a dream one night where Mary was coming to my house to clean as every other week, but this time in my living room there was a closed black coffin. When I asked her what was in there, she looked at me and said in a sad tone, "Dave is inside there." Now, if that wasn't strange enough, I remember waking up later that night and feeling a presence to the side of my bed, and I distinctly remember to have said while still being half asleep, "Come on Dave, let me get back to sleep." Next morning when I woke, my parents told me that Mary had called saying that Dave had passed that night due to COVID complication. To this day I still haven't told anyone about it, and I am still a bit freaked out from the whole story. This didn't happen to me, but a very nice old man and his wife used to live a few streets over from us. Well, she got very sick and his son flew in to help watch and care for her. A few weeks later she moved to hospice and later died. The night she died, her husband and son drive home and they were talking about what to do for the funeral, and the husband asked, "Do you think she'd want some person to attend?" And they both said they heard the dead mom/wife in the back seat say no thank you. My son, now 10, was 4 and was able to name my grandmother, by name, by a picture of her when she was in her 20s that was in storage that my mom and I were going through. She died before my wife and I even met. He said she was the lady who taught him how to do his silly laugh. Context: his silly laugh, as we called it, was a laugh that sounded just like my grandmother's. The reason it was so specific and silly was that my grandmother had a brain aneurysm when my mom was in her teens. It paralyzed the left of her body, including vocal cords and lips, and gave her a very distinct and odd-sounding laugh. We had a kitten-producing cat when I was about 6 or 7 years old. We knew it had kittens since it was pregnant for a while and then wasn't. We had no idea where the kittens were, which was an issue. I was curious about it and looked right at the cat, thinking to myself, "Where are your kittens?" But without saying anything, if that makes sense, my imagination immediately went to the location. Our cat could jump into it from pillars on the side of the porch through some damaged boards right above our porch. I knew they were around. I dashed over there, mounted the stone pillar, and peered through the gap in the boards. The kittens were right in front of me. I've never experienced another event like it in my entire life. In high school, I was getting peer pressured into doing something I didn't want to do, and would have gotten in a lot of trouble had a teacher come by, but I felt I didn't have a choice. I distinctly remember asking in my head, if I have a guardian angel right now, please pull the fire alarm or something. I kid you not, at that exact second, the fire alarm went off. This never happened at this school. It was so unlikely, I didn't expect it to actually happen. Nearly SHT my pants. We immediately went to the assembly area along with the rest of the school, and I got out of the situation. Turns out at that moment someone in the school had accidentally triggered the fire alarm. I spent the rest of the day in shock, honestly. I'd if this counts as supernatural, but what even are the chances? That day introduced me to the idea of guardian angels, and I have had many similar occasions since then where just in the nick of time, I've gotten out of potentially extremely bad situations either due to insane luck, or the nudge of something looking out for me. Edit: the thing I didn't want to do was that my friends wanted to smoke up. I had strict parents and the school had very strict drug policies, immediate expulsion. Also, I had never done a drug before and was scared and very uncomfortable. I wish it was something cooler and less lame. I had a dream at age 9 where I was walking through an alleyway with another boy, who I didn't know at the time, having a conversation about school grades or something. 2 years later I meet this boy, and turns out he's a friend of my brother who's a year older than me, but it still didn't hit me yet that he was the one I was walking with in my dream. Another 3 years pass, we are now in high school, and all three of us are walking through the usual alleyway that we pass through to get home. Then a conversation about school grades pop up and I get hit with the biggest realization and feeling of déjà vu ever. I was reliving the dream that occurred 5 years prior and my memory of the dream became very vivid at that moment. They thought I was a MF wizard predicting what they were gonna say a second before they speak. This happened 8 months ago. It was great. I was out with my parents, and it was late coming back home. At around 2:30 a.m. we were at a traffic signal. A homeless guy comes and knocks on the window of the seat where my mother was sitting. As she rolled down the window to give him money, he said, "Check what is happening at your brother's house." He proceeded to take the money and walked away, probably thinking that he was a bit crazy in the head. We didn't bother and went home. Next morning Mom gets a call from her brother's wife. He has had a heart attack. At 2:30 a.m. Woke up, needed to pee, went back to my room and there was a thing next to my bed. I remember it was very dark and spindly, shaped almost like Gollum, and its legs bent backwards and it seemed to have wisps of shadow coming off of it. I just stared at it for a few seconds before a woman's voice told me, "This isn't for you to see, you should go get a glass of water." So I turned my ass around and went to get a glass of water. I was in the kitchen, now awake enough to think it through, and convinced myself that it was our black fluffy cat, but then when I went back to my room and saw that my parents' door was closed, and remembered that they'd taken that cat in with them. I also remembered that I've seen that cat in the darkness before, and it doesn't look like weird Gollum, it looks like a bowling ball with stub feet. So then I assumed I just dreamed it. Well, when I got back to my room, the book that I'd been reading before bed and had left on the pillow next to me was sitting in the middle of my bedroom floor. I've told this story before on Reddit and someone told me that they've seen the Gollum critter too. I believe they said it was under their bed and that it had a lot of teeth. I had a phase in my mid-teens when I would read the obituaries in the local newspaper. I saw a name that was familiar as it was the same as a family friend. It had his full first, middle, and last names. I didn't say anything to my parents since I figured they already knew. A few days later my mom told me he died and I said I knew since I saw his obit. She said, "He died last night in his sleep." I went back through the newspapers. My mom kept them for a week before throwing them out, but the obit wasn't there. When the real obit came out it had his first and last name but just his middle initial. This was almost 40 years ago and I still think about it. Not me, but my mother. She tells two stories. One time her doctor changed her blood pressure meds. It caused her to pass out on the kitchen floor. She had a near-death experience that's similar to what a lot of people describe. The tunnel of light, dead family members coming to see her, incredible feeling of joy, etc. My uncle, her brother, was maybe 10 years older than her. Back in the 60s, he had a boat and used to take it from Florida to the Bahamas. It was a trip he had made many times. One day he left in the boat and vanished. A short time after, she was at work, and her phone rang. It was a woman. "Is this Carol?" "Yes. I just wanted you to know that your brother died an honorable death." Then the woman hung up. I live in a city and my brother lives in another city that is around 1,000 kilometers away. He visits sometimes but not quite often. On an average of once every 2 years. On one day around 7 years ago I was sleeping on the couch in the living room at my apartment. I woke up suddenly on my brother sitting just beside me and I was shocked/surprised, started greeting him and asking him about how is he doing and what pleasant surprise it was. Next thing I realized that this was a dream as the doorbell was ringing, which woke me. Went to open the door and guess what? It was my brother who came to surprise us. This literally had me speechless. Don't have any explanation and I think sometimes you don't need to have one. I was home alone in high school. It looked like car headlights were shining through our kitchen door, which didn't make sense because it was next to a field. I looked out the kitchen door and the lights were coming from about 50 feet off the ground. It was a row of 3 white lights and 1 red light. I opened the door and there was complete silence and the whole field was lit up. I closed the door quickly, turned around and it was gone. I dreamed the sequel to The Matrix years before it came out. I don't even think it had been announced yet. But that scene where Neo fights a Jillian Smiths in the playground? I had explained it in detail to my wife after I had the dream and we were both kind of taken aback seeing it on the screen. What a useless glimpse of the future. So I was too young to remember this firsthand and we moved to a new house a month before I turned 2 years old, to give you an idea of how young. But my parents told me that when we lived in our first house I would absolutely not go into my bedroom. I would put my hands and feet across the door frame and scream bloody murder, and no matter how hard my parents tried they could not get me into that room. One time my parents must have managed to actually get me in there, and I was crying my eyes out. My mom asks me what the matter was and apparently I just pointed to the corner and said funny man. Funny man in the corner. My parents let me stay in their room after that apparently. My buddy and I were playing tennis one night at some courts by my house. Lights usually went out at 11, but for whatever reason that night they went off at a weird time, like 10:43. Whatever, that was weird. We collected our stuff and started walking to my car about 500 feet from the courts. My buddy's mom pulls up right as we're getting to my car and goes, "Where the hell have you been? I called your cell and some guy was just laughing. It didn't sound like you." It was then my buddy realized he didn't have his phone on him. He told his mom to call his cell again and we could see it light up in the middle of the court we were playing on. By the net, but still definitely in between the single lines, not at all where we kept the rest of our stuff. He goes and gets it and only has the one missed call from his mom, the one she just made. He asked if she called the right number and her call log showed 3 calls to his phone all that night. We can't explain why the cell was on the court or what happened with the calls or what happened with the lights. It was surreal. I have quite a few actually. But one that happened pretty recently stands out. I grew up in a very rural area. Mostly crop farms everywhere. About a mile from my parents' house, there was this old abandoned farmhouse that all the area kids said was haunted. They would sneak into the house after dark, all the typical stupid kid crap, but I believe there are things in this world better left alone and never went. Years pass, the house fell into disrepair and was eventually torn down, leaving an old weathered barn. Well, I make a little side money selling photos of abandoned places, so I wanted to take a picture of the barn. I parked on the road and was walking up the drive. I made it about 10 feet before I just could not walk any further. My feet wouldn't move forward, my adrenaline spiked and I burst into tears. So I turned back and ran to my car. I didn't feel safe until I got past a nearby creek you have to cross to get there. I let it go. But a few months later we had to drive past the property after having Christmas dinner with my parents and there was a creature standing in the drive. It reminded me of the faun from Pan's Labyrinth, just super tall with a wide head and horns or antlers. but the eyes were more on the side of the head. Again adrenaline kicked in and I burst into tears, but I was trying to keep it together because I didn't want to freak out my kids. My husband asked if I was okay. I just said, "You saw that, right?" "Yep." "Was it human?" "Nope." I refused to drive that road ever again. My dad was a painter who passed away of cancer. Before he died he talked about God letting him paint the skies. The day he died there was a giant pink cloud that looked just like an angel. I don't know if I'd call it supernatural, but it was freaky and I still don't understand. I was in the kitchen cleaning up waiting for my kid's bus. I saw it pull up, and saw him get off. He didn't come in, but he'd started playing around with hiding under the window to jump out at me and say boo, so I thought that's what he was doing. But I walked out and he wasn't there. I called his name, and looked around the house thinking he was hiding from me, but I couldn't find him. I circled the house calling for him, and the parent panic set in. It probably only lasted 90 seconds but it felt a lot longer. Then his bus pulled up and he got off. As my great-grandfather passed away, my aunt and uncle had an unopened voicemail on their landline answering machine. As they listened to the voicemail, it sounded exactly like my great-grandpa saying "God help me" before it faded off. The thing that trips me out the most is how my aunt and uncle requested a log of their incoming/outgoing calls, and there were no calls logged in that time frame. I've heard the voicemail. So bananas. Apparently we lived with a benign spirit in our house for 3.5 years. This is my mother's account of what happened because my sister and I didn't see anything at the time. Only my brother, his best friend and my mother saw it. Back when we were living in South Africa we had moved into an apartment which we had bought. The moving in was actually quite eventful because a mother and her son were renting the place before, and although they had been notified they decided to stay past the date that was given to them. I'm not really sure about the details to that as I was around 7 or 8. Long story short, we moved in and started settling. After putting us to bed my mother decided to stay up and watch TV. My brother was out with his friends. As she's watching whatever show was on at the time she glances to our only plant in the house, which is about 1.5 meters tall, and sees a man roughly the same height as the plant standing under one of its leaves. Noping out of that SHD she gets up and flicks the lights on. He's not there. Calling it a night she goes to bed. The next day, or maybe 2 days later, I'm not sure on that detail, at breakfast my brother, who was around 16 at the time, picked up a piece of bread, turned around to the plant and said, "Hey Michael. Want some?" Laughing, my mother asks him who Michael is and he says Michael's the guy standing under the plant at night. Mind you, my mother didn't say anything to anyone about Michael to not freak us out. My brother's best friend was also over that morning. We had basically unofficially adopted him, and my mother asks him if he sees Michael too and he says yes. She then asks him to describe Michael and he gives a perfect description down to the whites of his eyes. Michael apparently was a black young man around 1/45 of a meter in height, wearing plain black trousers, a white button-down shirt, and a green vest. His skin tone was quite dark with a faint sheen to it. His eyes were also dark in velour and the whites were tinted a bit yellow. He had a permanent smiling expression on his face that didn't reach his eyes. He stayed put where he was, never moving but following you with his eyes. One morning my mom woke up to my dad coming home, who had bought this indoor circulating water thing. I really don't know what they're called. He moved the plant exactly opposite where it was, next to the couch, and put that water thing there instead. My mother didn't say anything, and that night Michael also moved with the plant. Of course, after hearing this I asked the next logical question that any sane person would ask. Why didn't she just throw away the plant? She said it never occurred to her facepalm. So yeah, that is the story of Michael, the benign smiling spirit that was a part of our family for some time. Edit: I had drawn the basic layout of our living room but it looked completely messed up when posted. So I erased it. Oh well. Edit 2, just spoke to my mother, she said Michael's eyes weren't dark but a dark honey color. How I forgot such a creepy detail is beyond me. But there you have it. Our 17 dog was euthanized last year. Miss her. I purged the house of all her stuff, donating all to a local shelter. The other day I was in my room, started thinking about her and cried some. I looked at her picture a while, then noticed some piece of paper on the floor. It was receipt from the pet shop 2 years ago for dog treats. I'm puzzled because I have no idea where it came from. I don't save receipts, and yet there it was laying in the middle of the floor in my room. I was biking down a country road I used to live on. I think I was 8 or 9, and on my way home I saw this small humanoid-looking being run across the road, from one crop field into a cornfield. The only details I could make out, and I still vividly remember, was that it was completely covered in yellow, from neck to feet, and I think it has green on its head. I told my mom about it and all she could come up with was something about Cabbage Patch Kids. Never saw that thing again. But I still think about it from time to time. Red luminescent ball flying on the horizon. It moved like nothing we'd ever seen, zipping around at incredible speed that defied the laws of physics. There were about 20 of us watching it, and some of the kids asked me what I thought it was. As I grew up living and breathing aviation with my dad, I had to tell them that since I couldn't identify what it was, that it was essentially a UFO. Had to then explain that it doesn't mean aliens, just that what we saw couldn't be identified by any knowledge I had of aircraft, not then, and not even now. It could have been ball lighting for all I knew at the time, but it was kilometers away above the horizon in the dusk sunlight. Woke up to a weird feeling, and saw an opaque silhouette of a little boy standing on the other side of the apartment facing me. I turned on my light and it was gone. When I turned my light off I saw it again. Flipped the light back on and went over there to make sure there was nothing that could be causing a weird shadow, etc. There was nothing there that could have created that specific shape, and it was standing in the pathway between my couch and wall, so it couldn't have been a shadow. I turned my light off again and it was there, flipped it back on and slept with the light on for the rest of the night. Couldn't sleep without the light on for days lol. I was furious with my daughter since she hadn't cleaned her room in weeks, so I assumed she was doing what I said when I walked by her room and saw her standing there. She went out of the bathroom shower with a towel wrapped around her and questioned why I was staring at her suspiciously a few minutes later. She seemed terrified when I questioned who was in her room. They didn't clean up the room, either, which I never figured out who they were. Me and my friend used to think we were amateur ghost hunters. One day we were hunting ghosts in his house, which had been owned by several families over the years. It was me, him and his sister. We would take turns holding the camera and asking questions to the potential spirits in the room. As we rewatched the footage we noticed at one point none of us were holding the camera. We were all in the shot together and the camera wasn't placed or mounted but was capturing us as if someone else was holding it. Went with my brother to see an old family property my mother had inherited in a really rural area. We were just looking about, it hadn't been lived in for decades. A bit of a wind, a bit of a rainy day, and both me and my brother were inspecting the house until we started hearing a weird rhythmic knock coming from around the building, just a knock at regular intervals much like a clock sounds but a lot louder. We stepped out to look around, but the noise started sounding like it was getting further away from us, until it disappeared. We left shortly afterwards. A couple of days go by, and I stopped by my mother's. I asked her if she has any pictures of the original owner of the house, which was her grandfather, so my great-grandfather. She pulled it out. Guess what? The man had a wooden leg as a result of a war injury. Told my mother all about it and it was like she was remembering him. She says that's exactly how it sounded when he walked on the porch. So weird. Edit. It's possible it was a bird tapping on wood somewhere around. But as far as I know, birds that do this tend to tap in a very rapid fashion. In my story above, the knocks were about 2 seconds or so apart, quite a bit different from how an animal usually behaves. I'm not into supernatural stuff, but that was eerie. When my daughter was about 10, she joined a softball league and Dad, taught her how to throw, hit, etc. I took her to a local Class AAA minor league game. I had never been to this stadium before. 16,000 seats, and had ordered tickets online. The seats I got were down the third base line, about as far away from home plate as you can get and still be in the stadium. Important. As the game progresses, she sees foul balls going into the stands and after a while asks if you can keep one if you catch it. I told her yes, and she said, "Catch me one, Daddy." I spent a few minutes explaining to her why that was very unlikely to happen where we were. As I'm finishing breaking her heart, I hear a bat crack, look up, and see a long, towering fly ball and knew immediately from my years playing baseball that this one was coming to me. All I had to do was stand up, raise my glove hand to my right ear, I'm a lefty, and that ball smacked perfectly in the webbing. The crowd cheered. 25 years later, I still have the memory of my daughter's face as I gave it to her. When I think about all the factors that had to come together for that to happen, a lefty batter, the right pitch and swing, the badly selected seating, that I even found and brought my old glove, It affirmed my belief that there is a higher power who sometimes grants small miracles. It was a bright afternoon and I was home alone, getting ready for my brother's hockey game. As I was finishing up in the bathroom mirror, I saw something inexplicable to my left in my brother's room. The figure of a tall, lanky man easily 7 feet appeared at the side of my brother's bed and swiftly walked to the other side of the room, out of my line of sight. I could only perceive the figure's silhouette and identified a wide-brimmed fedora and a long nose. Otherwise, he was completely pitch black. Void of light, the blackest black I have ever perceived. Confused, I walked into my brother's room, questioning whether I was really home alone. Of course, no one was there. I felt that sinking feeling in my stomach and asked my brother later that night if he ever saw someone in his room. He said no, but he's not the kind of person to admit to seeing a ghost. To be honest, months later I told a friend about what I saw and she said, "Oh, that's the Hat Man. People all over the world have seen him." I looked it up on Google Images and yes, it was the Hat Man. Edit, bonus story. I was probably 12 to 13 and woke up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. There was snow on the ground and a little bit of moonlight, so I didn't need to turn on the lights to see where I was going. As I came back to the door of my room, I froze. I can't quite explain it, but it's like some deep part of my brain was screaming and refused to send the signals to my body to move. I couldn't logic my way out of it. I was just stuck at my doorframe, looking into my room. On the other side of the room, sitting on my windowsill, were the 2 Amish dolls my grandma had given me a few years before. Amish dolls are stuffed soft cloth dolls in Amish clothing and no faces. My eyes snapped to the female doll and I couldn't look away from her. She was bathed in moon glow and clearly visible, even with the lights off. I have no idea how long I looked at her, frozen, maybe 2 minutes, maybe 45 minutes. Time stopped. Then, she slowly raised her right arm up above her head. Then slowly down, back into its resting position, when I could finally move again. I don't remember if I worked up the courage to go back to my bed or if I slept on the couch, but I did ask my dad to take the dolls away the next day. I had faced 3 different instances where I avoided getting run over by SUVs because I had to tie my shoelace when I was 19. They happened within a span of 6 weeks. My great-grandmother died when I was 5. About 12 years later, I was visiting her house, where my great-aunt still lived. I went to fetch a jersey from a wardrobe in one of the bedrooms. The wardrobe had a mirror on the door. Opened the door, took the jersey out and closed the door. I saw my great-grandmother's reflection standing next to mine in the mirror. I turned to check if she was really there, and she was. My great-aunt wasn't surprised. Apparently she had seen her mother's spirit too. This is a long story. I got my driver's license at 22 years old and was a nervous driver. One summer in 2014, my parents were going to our family's beach house with my at the time toddler son, and I was going to meet them there the following Saturday morning as I had work. At the time I was driving a beat-up 2000 Chevy Cavalier with no air conditioning, and my cigarette lighter was broken so I could not charge my GPS system in the car. I also didn't have a smartphone at the time, so I figured I would charge my GPS overnight and it would survive the hour-and-a-half drive to my family's beach house. What I didn't take into account, due to being a freshly licensed driver, was that Saturday morning traffic on the NJ Garden State Parkway in the summer is a nightmare. I also have an absolutely awful sense of direction and I can get a bit anxious when I get lost. I left my house around 8 in the morning and texted my parents that I would be at the beach house around 10 o'clock latest, and that I would take the baby to the beach when I got there. By 10:45 I was sitting in dead stop of traffic, sweating my butt off as there was no breeze. The GPS suggested I take a different exit than I normally would, and I jumped at the chance to get off the parkway. Whatever exit it wanted me to take also brought me to more dead stop traffic. At this point, my GPS was about to die and I had no idea where I was going. I didn't even have a bottle of water on me. Around 12:30, I was driving through random towns with no idea where I was, covered in sweat. My GPS had been dead for hours and I was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. I called my parents, who had no idea where I was, and they suggested I stop somewhere to ask for directions, but when I did find a fire station, no one was inside. I went back to my car utterly defeated and burst into tears. I didn't know what to do, and was half afraid I would never find my way home. I thought of my late uncle, who was a limo driver and the namesake of my son. I was sure he probably knew exactly where I was due to taking teenagers down the shore every year after their proms. I looked up at the ceiling of my car and cried, "Hey, Uncle C, I'm lost and afraid and I have to get to the baby. Where the hell am I?" All of a sudden, I heard the mechanical voice of the GPS say at the stop sign, "Make a right." I looked down at the GPS and saw that it was no longer dead, but it wasn't fully on either. Instead of it showing a map or the main menu, it was just a blank white screen. It repeated to me, at the stop sign, "Make a right." I figured I had maybe a minute or so before it died again, so I went to the stop sign and made the right. The GPS directed me for the next half an hour to the front of my family's beach house. As soon as I parked the car, instead of the typical "you have reached your destination" that the GPS usually said, it just went, "Goodbye," and then died again. I had never heard it say goodbye to me before that day, and I never heard it say that again. My family and I are convinced that my uncle helped me find my way home through the GPS. And yes, I got a smartphone that same year for Christmas so I would always have access to a GPS. Lol. When I was 17 I was at my friend's apartment building, which his parents owned. It was a pretty old building in the Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago, and according to his dad it used to be owned by Al Capone, but I'm not sure how true that was. We had an apartment on the top floor that they let us use to just hang out and it allowed us easy access to the attic. It had a lock on the door but we had a key, so we could go out to the roof and smoke cigarettes. One night, we were about to go up, but I had to pee, so I told him I'd meet him up there. After I was done, I went up the stairs to the attic portion that was connected to the roof. There were no lights, so we always used our phones to guide us. We had those old flip phones without lights, so you only had the light from the screen to help navigate the cluttered mess that was up there. As I made my way to the roof door, I saw a shadow pass by me. Now this wasn't like the shadow of something moving with the light of my phone. This shadow felt solid like a person. I followed the direction it went thinking it was my friend. I kept saying that I knew it was him and to stop playing around. It passed me a few more times, before heading to the other side of the attic, and that's when I heard my friend's voice from downstairs. He got a call from his girlfriend and was in another room talking to her the whole time. It really freaked me out, since I know I was following something. So I basically jumped down the stairs. I told my friend what happened and that I did not want to go back up there and he agreed, so we decided to go for a walk instead. Earlier this year his brother tells us in our group text that he found out the building's designer killed himself in that attic. Around 2002 staying the night with my cousins. Sleeping on the floor and woke up in the middle of the night, rolled over to go back to sleep and see a girl in a nightgown sitting down beside me staring at my cousin's bed. Rolled over, covered myself and went back to sleep. Was in my friend's mom's minivan. There were 4 of us and we were just talking and laughing, then it got quiet for no good reason, and at the exact same time, all 4 of us put our seatbelts on in complete silence. 5 minutes later the van got T-boned. We were all fine and standing around this smashed van we looked at each other and talked about how weird it was. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.